All right, welcome to part one of the weight management lecture. Yeah, it's a longer one, so definitely a two-parter. This covers chapter 11 in the Fink textbook, but I want to make sure that everyone understands. Yeah, chapter 11 in Fink talks about weight management, but not so much in the way that the dark side does, and not so much in the way that I do. So, when it comes to your reading up, of course, read chapter 11 in Fink, but really pay most attention to this would be a chapter 2 in the dark side, and actually chapter 1 in the dark side. So, the hold no myths to be true, which is chapter 1. Chapter 2, it's all about the hormones. Those are two chapters in the dark side that really support the information shared in this lecture. Fink gives a little bit more of an, I'll say, old school, kind of mainstream look at weight management, very much what Sean considers the box. So we'll take it from there. A good starting point with this conversation is something that, yeah, let's have a discussion, right? We can't do that on the online format, of course, but great questions to answer before we get into this is, yeah, why do we get fat? So as a population or as an individual, what are the causes of gaining unnecessary fat, right? So obviously we're not going to get into that. Yeah, fat is necessary part of our body for normal physiological function. We need some, but why do we get over fat? Why does this continue? Because there's clearly a situation in our country where, yeah, there are individuals who should lose fat. And as a population, percentage wise, numbers wise, we're getting fatter as time goes on. Why is this continuing despite the efforts of the medical and healthcare industries? Can exercise make us fat? Oh, we'll talk about that. I take a lot of crap from people by having this conversation, and sometimes I will argue that absolutely exercise of the wrong type in the wrong situations can be part of the problem and not the solution. That's not always the case, of course. There's no absolutes here. And then ultimately, how do we lose fat? Like, what are the strategies that we should employ to maximize our chances of achieving healthy weight goals? And so, these are questions, again, worth discussing as a group. Yeah, may or may not show up on the discussion board, just sort of depends on the feel of the semester as it goes on. That link on the bottom, that's a YouTube link to the Underground Wellness website. So that's Sean's Dark Side of Fat Loss. Underground Wellness is his main website. It's about a 5-6 minute video of Sean sort of discussing or setting the stage for this conversation, for this lecture. Check it out if you can. I don't think, again, you can click on this on through the video, so I don't know if you want to just type it in or just Google Sean how to lose fat kind of thing. So you can find it. So the learning outcomes for this discussion, yeah, pretty standard approach. We're going to understand and explore the causes of us gaining fat. What are the causes? What's behind it? It's not just we don't exercise enough and eat too much. That can't be it. Those are consequences of something else going on. That's what we're going to explore. Talk about different diets and exercise modes on how they affect weight management, fat management. And then we'll sort of get into talking about strategies that can lead to long-term success in terms of weight management or fat management. A couple of disclaimers. Yeah, so for this conversation, right, I'm going to be very much in the dark side mode, right? And so the conversation about calories in and calories out, they do explain weight change. Ultimately, for you to lose weight, you need to eat less than you burn, right? I mean, that's just sort of part of the equation. However, when it comes to dealing with why we get fat and how to manage it, that's a meaningless strategy, right? And again, I don't want to repeat things that Sean's already discussed, but you force yourself to eat less, that's not going to work. That you can't just starve yourself and hope for long-term outcomes. In the short term, sure, you can go on the show Survivor, right? That's like 39 days of eating very little food, and you've seen that show, some of you at least, right? At the end of the show, they lose 10, 15, 20 pounds, some of them. Yeah, because they've been forced to starve themselves. What happens by the time you see the reunion show? A month or two goes by. Yeah, it's all back and then some. We are, as humans, are not programmed to force ourselves to starve or eat less over long amounts of time with success. We'll talk about that. So we're going to ask that question, why are we overeating, right? What is the cause of the overeating? That might be more at the root of this situation versus just cutting straight to, yeah, you're overeating and that's it. So, and the other disclaimer, yeah, exercise is still good. And so I will bag on certain types of exercise a little bit. That doesn't mean exercise is bad. It just means as a means to achieve successful long-term weight loss, which is what we're going to be after, not short-term stuff, long-term weight loss. There are certain types and certain ways to exercise that are part of the problem and not necessarily part of the solution. So, how do we define obesity? What is it? How do we measure it? I use the stats from Australia still. When I taught in Australia, yes, I talked about this stuff as well. And Australians, like Americans, have challenges in terms of their weight gain and their fat gain as a population. And so when we talk about obesity, there is different ways to assess it. All you kinesiology majors out there, hopefully you've had a lab class where you've done maybe some skin folds testing or bioelectrical impedance, maybe underwater weighing. Obesity can be defined in different ways. The way governments and insurance companies and larger medical sort of industries look at obesity, it's usually by means of what's called the body mass index. That's what the stats on this screen and also the next screen where we'll have the American stats up there look at. They look at the body mass index, which is a ratio of your weight to height squared. Body mass index greater than 30, you're obese. So that's basically based on your height, you should weigh a certain amount or less. If you weigh over that amount, you're considered obese. You should all know that, yeah, there's limitations to using the body mass index. It doesn't consider muscle or fat, the components of muscle or fat of an individual. So you can be quite muscular and have a high body mass index and therefore be assumed that you're obese or over fat. So that is a massive drawback of the BMI. However, if we look at big populations, the percentage of people who will have an erroneously high body mass index is actually quite small. What percent of the population is overmuscular to where they might be at risk or might come up with a high or an obese body mass index? Not that many. Other ways to assess body fat, yeah, like I mentioned before, body mass index, bioelectrical impedance analysis, skin folds assessments, underwater weighing. Those are all fantastic. DEXA scan, there's other techniques as well. When we look at a percent body fat, then we're usually looking at thresholds for men around 25%, for women about 30-35% as being that over fat or obese threshold. Kind of depends on what resource you look at. So looking at Australia, they're having about a quarter of their population, right? Most of their country, most of their states fall into that 26 to 30% category. If we look at the U.S., the colors are a little bit different, but the numbers are quite similar, if not higher, right? So the Aussies were in this 25 to 30% zone, which we have kind of across different swaths of our country. A good chunk of, especially of our South, are in the 30 to 35% zone, and we even have some states that are above 35%. This is actually now, there should be new data out that will be an updated version of this. This is still from 2013. But what's probably more important to point out is that, yeah, these numbers have been constantly going up. And so as far back, which isn't that far back, in the late 1980s, the highest group, the highest category on this entire map for the U.S. was a 20 to 25% category. There's only a couple of states holding on to that at this point, where now it's basically the majority is at that 25% and above. So the trend has been working in a way that isn't desirable. We're getting showing more and more individuals as obese instead of less and less. So why do we care about this obesity thing? Again, this isn't the class to get into all the details, but it's at least worth reminding you or mentioning that, yeah, individuals who are over fat are at increased risk. Doesn't mean they're going to get it, but they're at increased risk for multiple health-related conditions. And there's a short list of those conditions on the screen right now. And so, again, there is some interesting research out there talking about individuals who are obese, and is it worth losing weight? Answer is yes. But is it worth losing weight and then having it come back? And the answer is actually not as obvious as you think. You figure, oh, yeah, if you're obese and you can lose that body fat and not be obese for a couple of years, but then it comes back, then you just lose it again. Well, they're finding that the stress that it puts on your body to go from sort of being obese to not obese, sort of that yo-yo effect, is quite stressful. And compared to individuals who just stay obese, that yo-yo sort of phenomenon of gaining fat, losing fat, gaining fat, losing fat, might be less healthy and have worse health outcomes than just remaining over fat and trying to maximize health and wellness through other strategies. So there's some interesting research going on out there that's not part of this discussion necessarily, but it is out there. So looking at why we care about obesity, yeah, it's a health related concern for individuals and also for our country. So an important question to ask, and this is for on a personal level and also on a client level, right? If for those of you that might go on into a field of sort of wellness coaching or nutrition counseling, that kind of stuff, what is a healthy body weight? Like, how do we know what somebody should weigh? There's good questions to ask typically for you college students, generally speaking. Your age, you're usually pretty young, right? If you're in that 20 to 22-year-old sort of range. I know most of my St. Mary's students are in that range. Thankfully, the CSU is a little bit more diverse in that age range, and we do have some more mature students, which I think is great. But what is the least weight maintained for more than a year? So if you can look back, and again, for those of you who are like 20 years old, it doesn't count because you just finished going through puberty, right? But what's the least weight you've maintained for more than a year and felt good about it, right? Not a year of starving yourself, right? So what is the weight that was maintained without constantly feeling deprived or hungry? You can use body fat percent goals. Hey, if I'm 20% body fat, my healthy weight would be at 10%. 12%, whatever I come up with that's realistic. What would my weight be at 12% body fat? That's going to be a healthy body weight based on percent body fat, whatever that might be. Setting these types of goals, it should be realistic. It should be something attainable. There's multiple strategies to get there. We're going to talk about some of them in this lecture. Based off of current status, a lot of these decisions are made, right? And so you don't want to take somebody who's already at a very healthy body weight or at least healthy percent body fat and go, oh yeah, no matter what, you should still drop it, right? And so I work with athletes sometimes who are in the single digits. Very rarely will I ever take, especially women, but even men, if they're at 6-7% body fat based on underwater weighing and skin folds, I am not going to say you should drop another few pounds of fat just because. So a good question then to understand and how to achieve that healthy body weight, what do we need to do? What do we need to eat to achieve that body weight? Well, ultimately, this all comes back to, I think, in my opinion, Sean's chapter, Do What Healthy People Do. I think that's chapter 3, right? The Do What Healthy People Do chapter really helps sort of shed a light on there isn't a one-size-fits-all type of strategy. We just need to practice healthy lifestyle habits. When it comes to food, that healthy lifestyle habit is choosing real food, right? It doesn't, involve choosing Franken foods and things that have been highly processed and don't look like food that comes from nature to begin with. It has to do with eating what's natural, fresh, raw, in season, in your community, in your region, wherever you live, right? And so those historical and cultural examples shared by, the work from Weston Price, amazing stuff. That is, to me at least, sort of that answer to what do we need to do? Yeah, we need to do what healthy people do, and that's basically being as close to sort of natural, real food consumption as possible. One of my favorite quotes from the dark side is, you need to be healthy to lose fat, not you need to lose fat to be healthy. And I think some of the mindset that we have, not just here in America, it's the same when I lived in Australia. They're very similar to us in the culture of fat and fat loss. The mindset is typically, lose your fat so you can get healthy. And if you do that, then you're going to be healthy. So do whatever it takes to lose fat. Some crazy things out there, right? Things like liposuction, things like some of these gastric surgeries, gastric bypass surgeries, that type of stuff. Those are not healthy ways to lose fat, and they usually don't lead to long-term healthy outcomes. So the mindset, I think, is backwards. If we take on the mindset, get healthy first, and that's when I work with my clients, that's my goal for them. Let's set up a healthy lifestyle. Let's ignore weight. Let's not weigh you. Let's not worry about body fat now. Let's get you healthy first. Hormonal balance, toxins, all those other things, sleep, stress, and then of course diet. Once you're in a healthy state, things tend to be much more likely to fall into place. Yeah, and we'll get into those ideas next. So again, one of my favorite quotes. All right, so what makes us fat? Huge question. A question that can't be answered in one sitting and even in one semester for sure. People have spent a lifetime studying the causes of obesity and causes of fat. So some of the culprits, right? Gluttony or overeating, sloth, and sedentary lifestyle are by far the two biggest targets in our culture right now. I mean, right? If you ask most health professionals, most people just on the street, why is somebody over fat? Oh, well, they don't exercise enough, or they eat too much, or both. It's the box, right? And that's sort of a big point of Sean's book. Other things that are on the list, yeah, you eat too much fat. It's not that you eat too much, it's just too much fat. There are relationships between socioeconomic status, which have interestingly changed over generations, right? And for a long time, those who were in the higher socioeconomic categories were the ones who tended to be over fat. They could afford the fancy foods that were highly processed and refined. As time sort of passed, that's flipped, and now the cheap foods, the foods that are most likely only available to those who are on the lower socioeconomic status levels, those are the highly processed foods and the highly refined foods that tend to lead to issues with health and being over fat. So it's been kind of a flip-flop there, or a change. Living in a toxic environment, yeah, we have things that we are exposed to both internally and externally that can mess with our body's physiology, leading to excess fat gain. We'll talk about that in the toxin chapter, in the dark side as well. Picking the right parents, genetics. Genetics plays a role, and that's something that needs to be dealt with and based on the individual, right? Is it carbs? We had our conversation about carbs. We had our conversation about fat. I think we can all agree that it's not either one of those. Making the smart choice about which version of those foods, what type of carbs and fats you consume, can play a role. So the best answer, and it's really not the best answer, but it is actually if you really dig into it, but the best answer, what makes us fat? Anything that promotes the flow of fatty acids into our fat cells. So what are the causes? What is promoting fats entering our fat cells, right? And we have in this class already at this point, you should have a pretty good understanding of, hey, what is going to trigger fat entering the cells? Is it insulin, right? Is it too many carbs? Is it too much fat? What are those things that are leading to fats entering fat cells? That's where we should be headed. Throughout this discussion, I'm going to share a few quotes. And so I have a couple of resources. Sean uses them a little bit as well. I use them quite a bit. A couple of resources that I help to support the arguments that I make in this talk. One of them comes from Gary Taubes' work. He has a couple of books, actually 3 books out now. I haven't read the last one. But his first 2 books, Good Calories, Bad Calories. The second book, Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It. Amazing books. Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It. One of my favorites all time. So I'll use some of the quotes that Mr. Taubes shares in his book. And those books I highly recommend to all of you if you have an interest in this area. Read them. They're very enlightening. They will, kind of build off the dark side, right? The dark side, if the dark side piques your interest, Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It is your next book to read by all means. So one of the quotes from Gary Taubes: the animal doesn't get fat because it overeats. It overeats because it's getting fat. So this is part of a conversation in Taubes' book, Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It, where he's trying to explore why animals, and this is based off of research on lab animals, that what caused them to get fat. And so one of the conclusions of a research article that he talks about, they conclude in the research, this isn't Gary Taubes' research, this is someone else's, that the animal didn't get fat because it overeats. It overate because it's getting fat. The cause and effect are reversed. In other words, the research concluded that, overeating wasn't causing weight gain. The animal was already gaining weight and it had to overeat to make up for that, or to support that gaining of weight. So he went on, both gluttony and sloth, so overeating and lack of exercise, are effects of the drive to get fatter. And so there's a lot of examples out there, even in humans, right? And if you take an individual, right, I have kids, they just went through puberty, or they're still going through it, I guess. What happens? Are my kids, or are you, or someone else going through a growth phase of life, infancy or puberty is a great one, you're going to grow no matter what, right? But what happens during that phase of puberty, my kids are they're incredibly hungry, they're eating all the time, and they're incredibly lazy is maybe a good word to use, right? They don't want to move. Their body's trying to grow. And so their metabolism, they don't have the motivation to move and exercise. They just want to eat. Are they growing because they're overeating? No, they're growing, and therefore they need to overeat to support that growth. And that's a lot of, this chapter in the Taub's book really focuses on the research that supports that. So important points. So let's talk about gluttony, right? So I want to pick apart a couple of the targets of our culture that sort of say, oh yeah, overeating is what's making us fat. So let's look at some of the research that may not support that. And so there is a lot of research out there. Let's take individuals and let's force them to overeat, and let's see what happens to weight gain. And so one thing that's important to note here, so if we take somebody who's healthy and we try and force them to overeat, will they gain fat? And that's sort of what this whole gluttony thing is saying, that, oh yeah, you overeat and therefore you're fat. So, okay, so I was healthy at one point. I wasn't over fat forever. Now I'm going to start overeating. Is that going to cause me to get fat? And so the research out there is actually pretty clear that no, it doesn't do that. And so there's a Mayo Clinic study, and this is one of several, that took a group of individuals and force-fed them basically an extra 1,000 calories a day for 8 weeks. So 56 days of, we can measure what your energy expenditure is, and we're going to say, okay, let's say you're burning 3,000 calories a day. We're going to force you to eat 4,000 calories a day. So after 8 weeks, these individuals in the study, it was only an 8-week study, after 8 weeks, they ate an extra 56,000 calories above what they burned, right, metabolically. The expected weight gain was somewhere in the neighborhood of 16 pounds. That's based on some very shaky math that says, oh, there's 3,500 calories in a pound of fat. That is not true. But so the expected weight gain should have, however, been around 16 pounds. In this study, and this is hundreds of people, the most weight gained was 7 pounds, or just under, and the least was 0. In other words, some people didn't gain any weight, even though you force-fed them an extra 56,000 calories over 8 weeks. How is this possible, right? And so this does get back to, if you don't have the signals in your body to ask your body or tell your body to grow, eating extra calories isn't going to force it to happen. The signal to grow needs to be there. And if the signal was missing in this group in the Mayo study, these were healthy people. They're healthy people who are force-fed extra calories. The body doesn't want to grow, it's not going to grow. And so some of the explanations are on this slide. And this is important stuff. I'll probably ask you something about this on a quiz or an exam, or most likely an exam. So know this slide. So how is this possible? So to eat more yet not gain weight. And so a couple things happen to us physiologically when we eat more food. First is that metabolism goes up. More energy comes in, metabolism goes up. Right? People who are starving aren't out there running marathons or are not out there bouncing around all over the place. If you are low on energy intake, you're going to have slower metabolism, be less likely to waste excess energy, right? You don't have any to waste. In the case of overeating, that's going to increase metabolism, makes us more likely to try and burn extra energy throughout the day. Secondly, there's an increased thermic effect of food. So eating an extra 1,000 calories a day and the thermic effect of food, I think we talked a little bit about possibly the digestion or metabolism talks. Thermic effect of food is just the energy that it takes to digest food, and that's assumed to be around 10%. So if you eat 1,000 calories, about 100 calories of the energy that you took in is dedicated to your digestive tract, your GI tract, to process, to digest, and absorb all that energy, or all that food. So if you eat an extra 1,000 calories a day, well, only 900 of it would count towards needing to get stored, because at least 100 of those 1,000 calories probably were just used metabolically to process that food. When we eat more, and this goes hand in hand with increased metabolism, unconscious activity increases. And there's been some cool research on this. And so what the research basically looks at is, if we force feed people to eat extra food throughout the day, what does their typical day look like, right? And they use all these activity trackers, the pedometers, and all these Fitbit kind of things now to to do this type of research. And what they find is that the more someone consumes throughout the day, the more likely they are to get kind of fidgety, the more likely they are to sort of have the crazy restless leg syndrome, the more likely they are to pace around versus just stand still, the more likely they are to stand versus sit. And these are kind of unconscious types of things that are directly related to increased metabolism, right? Your body's trying to burn off energy. And again, in this group of subjects in this Mayo Clinic study, yeah, you're force feeding them extra energy. All three of these things were going on. They're like, the bodies were not wanting to grow. They didn't want to gain fat. Let's figure out a way to get rid of this energy. So the fourth bullet was not a conclusion of the researchers. However, it's possible that, yeah, if you're over consuming, is it reasonable to think that there may be extra energy not absorbed and therefore excreted through, especially through your poop? It's possible. The research didn't look at that, but there is indications that that may happen at a low level, but still, all this adds up to us being able to deal with overeating by not getting fat. It's hard to force yourself to overeat for a long amount of time, by the way. There's some other great examples out there that deal with this. There's a blog out there called Fathead that kind of does more, it's not research, it's more sort of anecdotal stuff, but really deals with, how do we deal with overeating and how does the body, respond to that? There is what Sean talks about in his book, The Disappearing Calorie, and also the U.S. intake of energy. We eat about 500 to 600 more calories per individual in this country than we did 30 or 40 years ago. It's almost 40 years ago now. Us eating that extra energy per day, year to year, over time, individuals in this country should be in the neighborhood of like 500 to 600 pounds heavier over a lifetime of eating that much more energy. Why are we not heavier? So we're able to deal with that. The disappearing calories discussion, Sean mentions an individual, and I forget the exact stats, and you guys don't need to know those stats either, but an individual who weighs 600, 700, 800 pounds, who's eating 33,000 calories a day or something like that, but still isn't gaining much weight at all, almost staying at a steady state in terms of weight, even though they're eating 33,000 calories a day. Even if their energy expenditure was 10,000 calories a day, which it isn't, that's an extra 20,000 calories a day of energy intake. Why have they not continue to increase weight? The body's able to deal with it. So the conclusion from this slide is, forcing healthy people to overeat, it doesn't work. So gluttony as a cause of obesity, no, not so much. It might be a consequence. It's a symptom, right? People start to eat more because their body wants to gain weight. But this isn't the trigger that tells our body to get fat. That's a fair conclusion. Let's look at the next one, sloth. And so sloth is that, inactivity. I don't exercise. I have a sedentary lifestyle. Is this leading to obesity? It isn't necessarily the cause. Can exercise be a tool to help manage weight? Yes. The evidence that increased physical activity equals weight loss is actually pretty weak. And so there's tons of research out there, and there is research out there that says, if you force somebody to run 15 miles a day and prevent them from eating more because you were restricting their food intake, they're going to lose weight. There's no question about it. That's kind of the Survivor thing, right? That's the show. They're pretty active on that show throughout the day for the most part, at least what they show. And so their physical activity is high, their intake of food is low. It's going to force them to lose weight. But what does this mean in the real world? Well, we use American Heart Association and the American College of Sports Medicine, the AHA and ACSM. They put out these position statements every few years. And this is their position statement from 2007. I know it's dated, but they haven't updated it adequately since then. They have a 2009 statement that's actually worse than this. So in 2007, which, it's 10 plus years now, but this is what these two organizations concluded. They said it's reasonable to assume that persons with relatively high daily energy expenditures, which means people who do a lot of exercise, high daily energy expenditure, would be less likely to gain weight over time. So these people who exercise a lot, they would be less likely to gain weight over time compared to those who have low energy expenditures. So they're saying we should be able to assume, it'd be reasonable that those who exercise a lot would be less likely to gain weight compared to those who don't exercise. So far, data to support this hypothesis are not particularly compelling. So the best they could come up with is that, yeah, the data to support this, and this is in 2007, this is modern research still, the data to support the idea that exercising more would lead to less weight gain over time isn't very compelling. Very sad. As an exercise physiologist myself, when this came out, I was very sad to see this. I'm like, really? It would be great to be able to say, yep, the more you exercise in this specific way, the better you're going to be able to manage your weight, and we can deal with the weight gain sort of epidemic that we have in this country with exercise alone. From this statement alone, that was very much not the case. So let's talk about exercise. Let's talk about maybe why exercise as an individual tool, especially for long-term meaningful weight loss, isn't so good. Firstly, and you can all think about examples, what happens if you go for a 20, 30, let's say hour-long exercise session? What happens at the end of that? Are you hungry? Yeah, you're hungry. Your body's burning through energy. Your brain's smart. It knows that and it wants to replace it, right? So exercise increases hunger. What happens if we exercise and don't eat more? We'll lose weight. Over time, that deprivation isn't ideal, right? Especially if you're an athlete, but even if you're not an athlete, dealing with exercising and not satisfying that hunger that's there to help replace what you burn during exercise, we can force ourselves to do that for a while, but it doesn't last forever, and there will be a phase of trying to make up for that at some point. There's a phenomenon called overcompensation. And so remember this term as well. Overcompensation is this idea, and it happens all the time. And surely some of you have seen it happen, and some of you, maybe it happens to you, where, yeah, we exercise. And as humans, we love to reward ourselves. That's just one of our quirks as a human. Hey, I did good on that exam. I'm going to go out and celebrate tonight and, do this, right? Hey, we won the match. We're going to go celebrate. Well, we also like to reward ourselves for smaller accomplishments, right? And so, hey, I just did an exercise session. I woke up early. I did 3 miles on the treadmill. I'm going to go to Starbucks. I'm going to get the latte and I'm going to get that scone because I totally just worked out, right? Well, this idea of overcompensation is something that happens, especially with the status of our food supply. Everything that we buy is typically really high in sugar, right? You look at it, my example, a Starbucks, vanilla latte and a scone, we're talking 700, 800, 900 calories, and it's mostly coming from sugar, right? So I do my exercise session. I burn a couple hundred calories doing that exercise session. I reward myself with double or triple the calories in sugar. This phenomenon, this overcompensation phenomenon, is real, and a lot of people fall sort of victim to this phenomenon, and it's subconscious. We don't know that we're purposely overeating after we exercise, but what does that lead to over time? That can lead to then over consuming energy with the thought that, yeah, my exercise is actually the tool that's triggering this overconsumption, right? So that's overcompensation. Another thing that exercise does, and there's some interesting research on this as well. We typically move less on days we exercise. And again, it's a very subconscious thing. But when we exercise, hey, I did my workout today. I'm not taking the stairs. I already did my workout, taking the elevator, right? I'm going to work to find a parking space closer to the store because I don't want to walk across the parking lot, right? I'm going to sit instead of stand. Those types of things, there's been research done, and it's shown that people who don't exercise compared to those who do, there is a very much evening out, right? A bridging of the gap between energy expenditure of those who don't exercise because they do more of that subconscious type of movement. They are more likely to take the steps. They are more likely to be okay walking across a parking lot. Again, typically subconscious things. Is there research to support this? Yeah, there's plenty of research out there as well. Some cool studies. Again, there's a Danish marathon study that I found fascinating. It took a group of obese individuals in Denmark, and without any other clear interventions, especially none shared with the participants in the study, they took this group of obese individuals and helped them train for a marathon. I think it was a 3-month, it was either a 3 or 6 month training program that got these individuals who are sedentary to be able to run a marathon. At the end of the study, yes, the participants, I think almost all of them, and it wasn't a huge study, it was like 40 or 50 people, it wasn't like hundreds. But most, if not all the participants successfully completed the marathon. So they went from doing 0 miles per day to completing a 26-mile run. And of course, the training for that is, pretty much daily type of stuff. You would think at the end of the 3 or 6 months, however long it was, of them exercising to the point to where they could run 26 miles in a day, they'd lose some weight. Didn't happen. The average weight loss for the group was less than a pound. I think the entire group was able to maintain. Why was that? Well, the researchers didn't restrict eating, right? So they would go do these training sessions, and of course they'd compensate for it. Oh, I just ran a couple miles. I'm eating. I need to eat, right? And so it was an interesting study to read. There's a Stanford Runners Magazine study. I won't get too deep into the details of it, but it looks at over time what it took individuals. So it's based off of a survey done by Runners Magazine, published by Stanford. They did a massive survey where they tried to come up with a correlation between how much do you run and what has your weight change been. And what they found was that the older we get, the more we need to run to maintain weight. And the conclusion of the study was something along the lines of, by the time you're 60, you're going to have to average somewhere in the neighborhood of a 10-mile-a-day run to use exercise only as your weight management sort of tool. So, if you can run 10 miles a day when you're 60, you can eat whatever you want. But otherwise, the exercise in this case is not going to be that successful weight loss or weight management tool. All right, so we've kind of debunked the eating fat thing already in our fat discussion, right? So I don't want to get into too much details here. Does eating fat make us fat and sick? I think you can all conclude no. It isn't fat at the cause, right? We can't just eliminate fat from our diet and go, guess what? Now the weight's just going to start falling off. Oh my gosh, no, right? We're very good at taking low-fat, non-fat foods and eating twice as much of them sometimes because we think they're good for us, right? We can thank Ansel Keys, Dr. Keys. We mentioned him earlier about his 6-country studies. We talked about the issues with that study in terms of the number of countries was actually 22. Data collection technique, it only looked at available fat in those countries, not actually what was consumed anyway. This lipid hypothesis at the conclusion of his research is what directed this idea in our country, which again is very prevalent in Australia as well, that too much saturated fat equals higher cholesterol and increased obesity, which both lead to increased risk for heart disease. Very, very, I'd say in a way, unfortunate, misguided conclusion of some data there. Sean in his book asks the question, right? And this is in the Do What Healthy People Do chapter, I think, right? Is God stupid? And it wasn't meant to be offensive in any way, but almost in a sense of, look, we've had cultures over the millennia consuming foods that are natural to them and in their environment, and they've thrived, right? Without heart disease, without cancers, without obesity, right? And so he used the Maasai of Africa and the Inuit, which are basically Eskimos, right? As examples of cultures that eat 60 to 80% fat. Are they obese? No. Are they dying of heart disease? No. So how is it that, these cultures who, again, have been around for thousands of years, now all of a sudden we're saying it's the consumption of fat that's making us fat? It's like, well, why weren't they then getting fat thousands of years ago and having all the issues that we have as a country because of overconsumption of fat? And again, we don't overconsume fat in our country, by the way. There's also something called the French paradox. And for many years, even still, right, people wonder, the typical French diet is very high in saturated fat, very rich foods, lots of butter, lots of oils, lots of cheeses. But the French, very, very low rates of obesity, very low rates of heart disease. What's going on, right? For a couple, there's some good research out there on wine. Oh, well, the French consume a lot of wine. There must be something in the wine that protects them from getting heart disease and obesity. And there is some value to drinking wine in terms of protective mechanisms for heart disease, some good antioxidants in there. But that didn't explain the why are they not getting fat. And so this French paradox was, the French can eat fat and not get fat, but Americans can't eat fat because they're going to get fat. And so that was the paradox there. Obviously, it's because fat isn't making us fat, so that's why it's not making the French fat either. So, all right, that's the end of part 1. It seemed kind of short, right? We'll jump into part 2 right after this.